2013 might be remembered as the year the deep web broke into the mainstream. This year we saw the online black market Silk Road shut down and its founder, Ross Ulbricht, aka Dread Pirate Roberts, along with Freedom Hosting's Eric Marquise, arrested by the FBI. But is it actually possible to shut down the deep web? Joining us now to discuss the darkest depths of the internet is actor and filmmaker Alex Winter, who is currently making a documentary about the deep web. And in the Hangout, we're joined by Time correspondent Jay Newton-Small, who co-wrote Time magazine's cover piece about the deep web. So, Alex, you directed last year, Downloaded, this really acclaimed documentary about Napster, really sort of covered it with so much depth. It really covered the story of Napster. What did you learn while doing that documentary that made you want to start covering the deep web?
The world that I got interested in, that got me interested in Napster, well preceded Napster. And what's great about this story, what's fascinating about the story of the origins of the deep web, is they go back to the beginning of the architecture of the web itself. They go back decades. And so, you know, I got onto the web, I'd say, significantly in the early 90s through the BBS movement, which is very similar to a lot of what's going on in the dark web today, which led me to Napster, Sean Fanning, Sean Parker. So it's really been something I've been immersed in for a long time. And this movie is really, in a way, a continuation of the dialogue that I started with Downloaded, which, as you and I talked about, was more, my fascination with Napster was much more about the birth of global communities online, and very little about file sharing or music or sort of those aspects of it. I think that's what's significant about Napster, was this sort of, you know, the very radical architecture that got built, that exploded, that allowed for hundreds of millions of people to be online at the same time. And the world has changed radically since then. The deep web is only, what it means is actually almost mundane. It really just refers to everything that's on the web that's unindexable, right, or just unindexed, whether consciously or unconsciously unindexed. It does not refer to drug markets, and that's what is actually more specifically referred to as the dark web. And the deep web is a big giant ocean, and the dark web is a tiny little sliver of that ocean all the way over here. It's like one little car in a massive highway. And it's significant, don't get me wrong. And the things that are going on within that space are significant. But the lack of understanding and the lack of the fuzziness of the definitions can cause problems, in my perspective. One of them, I'd say the most glaring one, is the notion that Bitcoin is somehow a dark web currency, which it isn't. It's an unregulated cyber currency. You know, it's you know, using cryptography. And it exists for purely legitimate reasons as much. It's like, you know, the US dollar is as much a drug currency as Bitcoin. In other words, you can use it to go buy, you know, a soda, or you can use it to buy drugs.
Well, what are some of the positive things that we should cover, that we should talk about?
I mean, there's so many. You know, the whole crux of my doc is mostly about positive. You know, the changes that have been brought forth by the ability for there to be a global community, you know, and frankly, not to demonize the government either, you know, the ability for the government to move, and various governments around the world, and then people to move freely within, you know, outside of, if they have an authoritarian regime, move outside of that regime. I mean, that's really significant. And the reality of it is I think that the technology is hard for people to wrap their heads around. I think that when something is confusing, I watched this happen with Napster, it immediately gets defined and put in a box. It's very hard to break that thing out of that box. And so I think it's really incumbent upon people to say, you know, it's not a black and white issue. It's not you're either for the deep web or against the deep web. The deep web refers to a massive store of information and people, right? Actual human beings. It's a matter of just looking at it and going, these are people that are using these new technologies. Most of them are great. Some of them are not so great. The feds seem to be dealing with the ones that are not so great. And we need to be able to understand and embrace these technologies.
Jump in there. I think there's also a lot of confusion in Washington on how you actually regulate this stuff, because it is so far ahead of, you know, Washington. Washington's not very good at sort of dealing with technology. And you know, there's huge questions whether you, for example, Bitcoin, which is a currency, but do you call it a currency? Well, according to Treasury, only sovereign nations can issue currencies. Do you call it a commodity? Do you call it a security, a bond? How do you regulate it? Who gets, you know, the power to regulate it? And until those questions are answered, it's going to be very hard for mainstream kind of banks and investors to really go in and then use Bitcoin, because there's so much uncertainty in a regulatory front. So again, as these things are still somewhat in the shadows, and until Washington really sets the tone on how you're going to tax these things, whether, you know, how they're going to sort of police these things, they still are a little bit in the gray area.